Welcome back. Now that you know what dependency properties are, it's time to check out data binding because they are interlinked to each other or connected to each other. So in this video, we are going to talk about the four different binding modes. So modes of data binding. And there is one that's called one way. So it goes from the binding source towards the binding target. Then there's the binding target towards binding source and backwards, which is the two-way mode. And then we have the one way to source, which sends information from the target towards the source. And finally, we have the binding target one time, which is the binding source done in constructor or during initialization. So let's check out an example for that. We can have a text box here where we can enter text in. So I'm just gonna give it a width of, let's say, 100. And I'm going to give it a margin of, let's say, 50 pixels. Now I want to use a stack panel instead of a grid. So I'm going to change the name to stack panel. Now in that text box, I'm going to assign a text called, it's just going to say something like 15. And below that, I will create a slider. So that slider should have a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 100. Now let's just run the code as is so you can see what we have created there. And as you can see, there is a value of 15. It's a text box, so I can change the text if I like. And there's the slider. And now what I want to do is I want to connect those two. So I want to connect the slider to the text box. And as you have seen, there are four different ways of connecting. And the one that I'm going to use first is the one-way data binding. So in here, I'm going to say that the text of my text box should be bound. So I will use binding here. And I want to know to whom should I bind. So I want to bind to the slider. So in order to communicate with the slider or to access the slider needs to have a name. So I'm going to give it the name my slider. And now I can add that name in here. So the element name that I want to bind is the my slider. And actually this is not in hyphens. Now the next thing is I need to have a path. So what is it that I want to have from the slider? And it could be multiple properties, right? But the one that I am interested in is the value, because I want to know the value of my slider. So I say path equal value. And now finally, I need to assign the mode, and we're going to start off with the one-way mode. And before I can test that, of course, I need to get rid of my old text that I had there. And now we can go ahead and run the code. And we will see if I drag the slider, the value here changes as well. Now, as you can see, it has very many floating point values here, or long floating point value. And I want to have whole numbers. So what I can do is I can use something called is snap to tick enabled. So is snap to tick enabled, that one here. And I'm gonna say it's true. So I want it to be enabled. So if I run it again, then you will see we only will get whole values here, whole numbers. All right, so that's great. But now what you also can see, by the way, is that it's not connected to the slider. So the text is connected, or the data source is our slider and the target is our text box. So as you can see, the data is sent to the text box. But as we have set the mode to one way, if I change the value of my text here, or my text box, the slider will not be interested in that. So it will not change anything. So let's enter 25, for example, slider doesn't care. So if we change that to two-way, then it will care. And now, by the way, just for you, this one here, so our text box is our target. Text box is the target. And our slider is the binding source. So slider is binding source. And now this whole thing here at the top makes a lot more sense, right? So now we use the two-way mode, and you will see what that means in a second. So there we are. If I now enter a value in here and I press tab, just so that the value is taken into consideration, and you can see that our slider changes its value. So now they are connected both ways. What if I only wanted to have one way, but towards the source? So only the text should influence the slider, but the slider should not influence the text box. Well, then we can use this one way to source mode. So I'm going to use one way to source. So let's run it again. And now if I change the value here, as you can see, nothing changes. But if I add a value in here, the slider is changing. All right, so that's the one way to source. And now finally, the one time mode. Let's go into our main window XAML. We will need to write some code because, as I said, it has to be done during initialization or in the constructor. And in our case, it's in the constructor of our main window. And we go ahead and use this for one-time binding. So I'm gonna access my slider and I'm gonna set the value to, let's say, 30. Now I want to access the text box, and as you can see, we can simply access this slider here because it has a name and it is in the same class, so we can straight away access it. But now the text box does not have a name yet, so I'm going to give it a name, which is going to be my text box. And now we can go ahead and access this text box. My text box dot text should be the my slider dot value dot toString. So now the value of the slider at start will be 30, and the text of the text box will be the value of the slider as a string, which is going to be 30 as well. But it's not that we fixed it. Well, we fixed the value of the slider, and the text hereby is also set once. So that's the one time mode here. As you can see, if I change the slider now, our text is not changing. If I change the value to 25, nothing is changing either. So let's have one more look at something that might be interesting for you as well. So now I want it to change two ways, but I also want it to change without me having to press tab. And that's something that is triggered if we use the following approach. So I'm going to add something to my data binding here. As you can see, there are multiple different properties that we can access. And the one that I want to use now is the update source trigger. That one here. Update source trigger. And as you can see here, default, explicit, lost focus. The one that's interesting for us is this property changed. So I want this to be triggered whenever the property is changed. So that means whenever the slider or whenever the text is changed. So let's run this again. Now remember, we're using two-way again. And I set it at 30 or 230 at the start, so it doesn't bother. We can still use it in two-way mode, of course. But now if I, let's say, change it to 25, or even while I'm typing. So I'm typing something like 5, 5. Even the 5 was taken into consideration here, or was changing something. So if I add a value higher than 100, so let's say I'm trying to add 555, you see that it goes to the maximum value, which is 100. So if I play around with it, you can see it's changed directly. And that is because we have this additional information here, which says update source trigger property changed. So whenever the property of our text box, which is the text property, changes, that's when this update source trigger should be executed. And then this whole text is changing. The text box, slider, they're all changing. All right, because they're bound, right? They're bound to each other two ways. So that's one major example of data binding. There is a lot more to know about data binding. We have just bound the value, but you can also bind many other aspects as well. So for example, here you see path is value, but As you see, it's a property path, but there are plenty more. So let's say I want to bind the background. So let's say the background of my slider changes, and you see 0, 0, F, 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 and so forth. That's the background of the slider, and the background of the slider is gray. So if I now change the background of the slider to, let's say, aqua, suddenly the value of my text is FF01 FFF. So that's the hexadecimal value for the color aqua. If I change it to white, it should be plenty of Fs. If I change it to black, it should be plenty of zeros. As you see, FF, well, that's the alpha value, and then you have the hexadecimal value 0, 0, 0, and so forth. So that's what you can do with data binding. Not just the value, you can bind pretty much every property that they share with each other. All right, so I'm gonna go back to the value here and gonna save the project. So I hope you enjoyed this video. In the next video, we are gonna go ahead and do some more interesting stuff with WPF.